Hello, this is Alex from cables.gl. I'd like to show you how to set up lights and also add shadows inside your projects in cables.gl. So the complicated thing is, of course, shadows. And if you've already looked at the operator, there's so many parameters that are a little bit daunting once you get into it. There's different algorithms, there's different settings for the algorithms, there's also settings for the shadows inside the lights. And in this tutorial, I'm just going to show you the simplest way to get started. And then, of course, you can experiment with all the different types, because I think if we cover them all, it might be a bit too long. But even with just the directional light, you can get your scenes looking so much better with adjusted angles and adding some shadows. So, okay, I got some projects to show you, and then we're going to jump in and set it up from scratch. So in this quite simple scene, we have a texture projection with some textures that look like caustics, sort of. But the shadow, I think, gives you this extra feeling of like maybe we're underwater or there's sunlight coming from somewhere. So I think adding this sort of stuff to your scenes will just make them more believable, or maybe more creatively, like get a message across, something like that. So in this another simple scene without the shadow, it just looked so boring to me. So once you add it, you're kind of like, oh, okay, there's a light somewhere, and there's this thing is kind of 3D, it's popping out of the cube, and it's moving around, and there's a shadow to kind of guide our imagination, so to speak. And in this scene is a 3D model, which I think we'll return to, because it was a kind of a discovery slash tip that I want to show you how to make shadows on quite complicated, for example, sculptures or characters look really nice. And yeah, let's return to that a little bit later. So also, you can do like pretty crazy creative effects with lights and cables. So, for you who know me, you know I love color area. But in this example, I tried to see what kind of stuff can I do with a spotlight, or actually, it's a point light on. Let me zoom out here on a simple plane that has a Phong material on there. And with a bunch of weird settings, you can actually paint with light, and then you add some kind of feedback effects, and then they smudge around, and you add some hue, and you get this really funky effect. So I think lights are not just for lighting your scenes and adding shadows and things like that. I think you can really experiment and get interesting colors, and also yeah, I'll show you later. So, and one more thing I wanted to show is, of course, we have the new PBR material. It's fantastic. But if you know the way PBR works, it uses a texture to kind of simulate the lights and the surface physics of the material. But the shadow just helps it kind of become more physical. So it might not be the most correct thing, but in this approximation, and of course, you can push and pull these colors and make them brighter and lighter, and maybe add more than one shadow to then get a more realistic kind of physical object in your scene. So just want to make sure you know that it doesn't really matter if it's a Phong material, Lambert material, even a basic material, but you can add a shadow to our new PBR materials. Alrighty, so I have this scene, right? Already has a shadow, but we'll take it out and we'll start from scratch. So you see that I have this thing called the shadow operator, and now the shadow disappears. And then I have a directional light, and you see this blue line, right? It's a kind of a guide. And if you don't have it on your screen, maybe you've toggled it off. It's actually a helper. And if you click, let me click on the editor first. And then when you click on your renderer window, you get this little menu on the bottom, and you can go over to this toggle helper and then show selected op helper. So when I select some op that does have a helper, for example, like this directional light, I see this line that kind of gives me an approximation or the exact location position of this light. So when I move it around, you'll see this line move around as well. Um, Pretty nice little helper. Lets you set up your lights a little bit easier. So pay attention to this thing. Maybe um, comment below how it goes for you. But I like using it, and it helps me understand that, okay, yeah, it's coming around from this direction, and it's going through the center, and etc. So we'll delete the directional light again. And if you see this on your screen, for example, when you create a project, you know that, yeah, when I add a Phong material, it's already lit. And yeah, okay, that's it. But that's just the default point light that's kind of placed at our camera view, or like at our center kind of location of where the camera is, right? So you can kind of imagine the light is a little bit behind the camera as we're looking at it. And that's the default light. And to override that default light, you can put down your own light. So we have a point light. Then we have a directional light. And then there's also, I think, called the spotlight. Yeah, the spotlight, one of the most complicated ones, but it has really nice controls for you to get that, spotlight, as if you're in a theater or something, like on stage. You get this control over the cone width and size and all that stuff. But we're just gonna do directional light for now, and maybe I'll show you some of the other lights. But directional light is super easy to get into, and it has less parameters than the other ones, and the shadow parameters for it are really nice and simple to use. So I really like using it, or at least like to start to introduce this concept of adding shadows to your projects with the directional light. So let's put it down. And where do we put this directional light? It's kind of important. You see, I have the scene with my objects right here, my rectangle, which is my floor. If I hide it, you see it disappears. So I got this big rectangle as my floor, kind of. And then I have the sphere, cone, and cube. And the cube has a timer, so it's rotating in place. And they are all under this Phong material. So although they're on a sequence here, they're still under the Phong material. So the Phong material is coming to every single one of those 3D geometries and giving it that material. Where do we put the directional light? I highly recommend you always kind of keep it separated, maybe visually, so you remember like, oh, okay, my whole scene is getting this light. Don't bury it somewhere in there. I always used to do this, and it just becomes a bit more complicated for you to organize your scene. So what you do want to do, though, is put it below your camera. So try to think of kind of in your head the setup of your scene in cables. So I have a camera view, and then the directional light or the point light will go into that camera view, right? So it goes under all these things. So when I rotate, everything stays together. And I'm pretty sure you can, of course, experiment with putting this directional light above your camera, but then it gets funky. And when you start to apply the different settings for it with shadows connected, it gets really weird. So you should try to put your directional lights under your camera, or at least under your orbit light, because you're changing this location all the time of your camera, so you don't really want to affect the shadow as well. But I don't know, maybe it's just my personal thing and something I should consider to talk about with the rest of the team. Anyway, so we have this directional light, right? And we let's make this parameter panel a bit more visible. We have quite a few settings, right? We have cast light, so if I turn it off, there is no more light, and we don't see our default point light because we're overriding the default point light with this new light that we have in the scene. Then we have the intensity, where we can control the brightness. And for example, the Phong material does interact with the brightness of your light, so you can kind of see it starts to blow out sometimes. Um, but yeah, just get it to a nice setting you want, or maybe blow it out for creative use. Then, of course, we have the direction. So that would be um, from where does the light go? Because it always intersects with the center. And I think that's also like why it's kind of easier to set up, because you're just kind of like, okay, I'm going to point this thing at the center, but I'm going to tell from where is it coming, right? So you can think of it maybe as like a sunlight or something like that. Cone light and point light are a little bit different. You can control like the location where that light falls or where it is. But with directional, you just control the direction. Then we have the color. We can set it to a different color. So that would be the color of the lamp, for example, in the light, right? And then the specular, some materials have a specular on it, right? So if we bump up maybe the shininess to some extreme, make it Fong, and then when we go back to our directional light and change the specular color, we should see a difference. So when it's too bright, yeah, it's too bright because we're mixing color of the lights together, right? So it's a little bit different than mixing paint together. So you gotta remember to decrease your brightness, because at 100% brightness, you're not going to be able to see the colors, right? You can kind of imagine it maybe in real life as well. If you boost up the brightness of your lamp too much, you might not even tell what the specular is anymore. But anyway, so keep that in mind. So if you're doing kind of a low darkness specular, you might have to turn down the overall color of your light, which in the light sense also means the brightness of this light. So hopefully that was not confusing. So we can play around with the specular color. Usually it's somewhere around white, or I mean, it depends on what kind of material you're trying to make, right? Maybe some paint will have a different specular because of some kind of subsurface stuff going on, or the chemistry of the material. The specular might be different. So keep in mind you can change the specular on, I think, every single light. You can keep it all at white and see what happens. Then we have this whole section for cast shadow. This is very important because do we have anything else to cover? No. So that's the last section and the one I wanted to show you. Cast shadow. By itself, it's not going to cast anything. So there's no default shadow setting. So we need to use that shadow op that I showed you before. So if we type in shadow in our search, we can place it down, and then we see this warning. There are lights in the patch, but none that cast shadows. So that is exactly where you find this toggle inside your lights. And you can have more than one light in your scene as well, but you might not necessarily want to cast a shadow from all of them, because remember, it's CPU intensive. So remember that you can control which light casts a shadow and which doesn't. But definitely try casting all the shadows and see how it performs. I think it's not that bad. So when we turn on the shadows, we get this effect. And you might think, wow, I am pretty much done with shadows because that looks pretty terrible. No fear. We're going to go through these settings to kind of tighten this up, and I'm going to get it, hopefully like make it a little bit clearer how to control this whole setup. All right, so the first thing I usually start with is go back to the shadow op that is affecting all of my geometry here, and choose PCF as my algorithm, because it kind of smooths out the shadows, and allows you to also control the number of samples. So if we go to one sample, it pretty much looks like this default one, the like super light, cheap shadow that you might want to use somewhere. So we'll leave it at 4, and then you'll see that even if default on PCF, if we switch from default to PCF, we still have this weird kind of empty space where we shouldn't have an empty space. So how do we get rid of this? And this is all in this light setting. So what this allows us to do is maybe like stack shadows as well. We can maybe get really creative with what part of the scene will be covered with the shadow. But the default on the directional light doesn't really look great on this particular scene, right? I have this hole. How do I get rid of it? What I like to do is usually go to bias 0 and then see how it looks. And it looks pretty good. So I'm going to leave it at 0. But in some other cases, you might need to bump it up slightly. And you can really like just type in numbers here. And I recommend going up like really slightly, like maybe 0, 1. Okay, that's too much. Then I'll put another 0 in there. That's pretty good. If I put another 0, it's a little bit better. And if I put 0, it's like perfect for this scene. And that's something you have to remember is like this really matters per object or per geometry that you're putting this shadow effect on. Then we already have a pretty decent scene, but you see it's a bit blurry and like super low res. Why is that? And to control this, I like to use this output port, and I'm pretty sure every single light also has it. Let me just double check this. Spotlight, yeah, this has a shadow map output, and then point light. Yeah, so there's this texture cube map texture output that you can use to guide you how to set up your shadow like optimally for your scene. And then we can just put down this trusty Viz texture. And when I see that my shadow is not only pixelated in my scene, but it's also visibly tiny in my output from this light texture output, I know that I have to go to my directional light and then scroll down to the LR bottom top controls. So this left, right, bottom, top control will allow me to scale the object's shadow in my texture, which is also controlled by the map size. So the resolution for the map size is kind of the quality of the texture, but also the size of my shadow in my texture is how pixelated or how maybe even smoothed out it looks in my scene. So I think you might even get into, as you get more handy with this stuff, you might want to actually increase some of this pixelation to kind of allow you to get sort of blurry shadows. But for the most part, I like, oh yeah, and see, when I go way too, when I zoom in this left, right, bottom, top control, and I cover my entire texture with my shadow map, you start to get artifacts. So this also happens when your shapes might be like really big, and even the default of the shadow will cause some sort of artifacts like that. So you just need to remember that, oh yeah, that's my kind of texture being covered by the shadow that is generated by my geometry. So return to this setting and adjust it, and highly recommend using this Viz texture to kind of frame this scene for you to easily avoid artifacts. So super handy. So I want really crisp shadows, so I'm going to try to fit this shadow map as perfectly as I can into my texture, and I'm already getting somewhere. Pretty good. It's nice. So another thing you can do with the shadow is to kind of control the brightness of, or I mean the darkness of it. So we have this control here in the shadow strength, and this might make sense maybe if you have multiple lights in the scene, right? So you have some light spill, and the shadow wouldn't be black. So you can adjust it here, or you can go per shadow or per shadow op and adjust that in the color as well. And that's kind of handy. you can actually paint it. You can get like in different color shadows if you need to make your scene a particular way. So yeah, I think you're starting to understand like, okay, yeah, there's quite a lot of controls, and I kind of need to already have in mind uh, what kind of shadow I need to create here with this tool. Reference, highly recommended. Keep studying the way shadows work, because yeah, in this setup, or in this implementation, we're kind of like, we have a lot of flexibility, but also we need to be able to create our shadows the way we want from what we think they should look like. All right, so we have this shadow, and another thing I want to show you is when I adjust my light direction, for example, with this directional light op, you see that the Viz texture is showing how the shadow map changes, right? Because the direction of the light changes, and the way the shadow is painted is changing as well. So, for example, when we get our sun closer to the horizon, for example, we get longer shadows, and then you might start to get these weird artifacts, right? What is happening here? When you see this, an artifact like this, you need to know that the shadow needs to have a wider, or like a longer draw distance. And this is controlled in the light settings and the shadow settings here. And this is what this near and far controls are for. So if we start to see that, okay, I'm getting into like extreme angles of my shadows, and I'm getting stuff like this, and what's happening here that doesn't make any sense. Um, first of all, hold on. First of all, we need to make sure all the objects in our scene are casting the correct shadow, right? So right now I have this shadow op that is then uh, is considered by all these operators below. So all these geometries are using the setting in this shadow op. And for example, for the floor, I don't want it to cast a shadow, because once you click on the shadow op, you see that it has a toggle for cast shadow and receive shadow. So the first thing you kind of need to think about is like, are all the objects in my scene supposed to be casting shadows? And for stuff like floor, I usually don't want it to cast any shadows, so I add its own shadow op for my floors. So I'll put it down here and just click on it and then toggle off cast shadow. So now my floor is not casting any shadows. Not Doesn't matter from where the light is pointing. It's not casting any shadows, but it's receiving the shadows from all these other ops that are still getting this shadow, right? And of course, you can put an individual op per object, but I kind of like to do this funky stack of, okay, everyone's getting the shadow, but then this particular one's going to have a specific setting, so I'm going to give it its own shadow operator. All right, so a little bit of a tangent, but we still have this issue, right? So when we adjust our angle, we still have this weird, like, creeping shadow that's starting to cover our whole scene. And whenever I see an artifact like this, I know that the setting for near and far are not exactly correct for my scene. So if I go to far and then adjust it and then give it more distance, draw distance, then you see that it disappears, and now I can control my um, light direction a little bit easier and not worry about this thing coming back. And you see it's back again, and maybe I need to give it some more. There it is. And then if I adjust it again, yeah. So you kind of have to play around with it, and you can think, okay, like maybe I just increase it to something mad, like 1,000. Can I? 1,000, right? So now when I change my direction, it's pretty good. But with certain scenes, it's not recommended, because it also starts to kind of affect the quality of your shadow. But um, that's already advanced stuff. I don't know. It's definitely if you get into a jam where just putting this near on 0 on far on 1000, let me know what happened, and show me the artifacts, because I rarely get them, but when I do, they actually allow me to do some interesting things like adjust the spread of the shadow or the strength of it and certain. Anyway, weird tangent, but yeah, sometimes it's just fine to put this far uh, number to like something extreme, like 100 or something like that. Then we have some more controls in the light for polygon offset, and you basically have to visually see what happens with your shadow when you use this. Usually I just leave it at 0 because I don't need to. It's mainly for like adjusting the look of your final scene, because maybe something is popping out and you don't want it there. So you can use this polygon offset to tell the shadow not to draw something at a particular place or something like that. But usually you're fine with just 0. Normal offset is also kind of a weird, funky thing for adjusting for specific shapes, but you can also leave it at 0. And blur amount is best used with a different shadow type. For example, like VSM, or yeah, I think VSM is the best one for blur, but it also works with PCF and Poisson. But I don't think I'm going to cover it in this tutorial, but definitely play around with VSM and blur and see how it works. Otherwise, this tutorial is going to be super long, and maybe I'll make a part 2 or something. All right, so what else can we do? All right, let's go back to something more complicated, like a shape like this, right? So let's say I have a sculpture, and I want to have really nice shadows in it, right? I have pretty much the same setup. I have a GLTF scene with a Phong material, and then just a single directional light. And I think this isn't doing anything, so I'll remove it. Color area, I'm not sure what it's doing here. Nothing. Blend mode, none. It's a trick. I'll cover sometime later. Or at a meetup. Come to the meetup. Ask me about the blend mode trick. All right, so we have this guy. And he has a shadow. And it looks pretty good, right? Why does it look good? Because when I used to do this stuff, and I had my directional light, it would look more like this. So you notice, like in this scene, we didn't do this. We didn't have any problems really. Everything looks fine. The cube looks like it's getting a cube or making a cube shadow. The sphere is making a sphere shadow. But when you get into super complicated meshes like this one, and you just throw down a shadow and a light, I'm sure you might have gotten into this, but I'm so happy to share with you the trick for getting it to look right. So look, when we're changing the location of the light, you get these weird artifacts, and it's the material looks fine, but then the shadow looks all over the place. And what's happening is the shadow is looking at the entire geometry, and it's using the entire surface of it to create this cube map shadow. And what it needs to do is not to look at, for example, the back faces of your geometry, and only look at the faces that are facing the light. And that way, your shadow that is getting generated is going to be exactly what you would expect in real world. There might be times where you do need the back face of a geometry to be made with the shadow, but in cases like this where you have like a closed, watertight sculpture, for example, you don't really need this back face of a material to be seen by the shadow. So the best way to do it, I think the quickest way, is to use this face culling operator and just throw it down somewhere in your scene above your geometry to then cull away the back faces of your geometry. So now when we're changing the shadow or the direction of the um, light, it looks a lot better. And let me just see if putting it somewhere else is even better. And that's pretty much the same. Maybe I have this other point light. Yeah. That's another thing. So once we have one light and this face culling trick, or actually, it's not really a trick. It's kind of what you're supposed to be doing. I just didn't know. But now you know. Then when we control our direction of the light, the shadows look really nice. And things like sculptures and more complicated geometry will have quite decent shadows, and everyone will love you. What I was doing here is quite interesting. And I wonder if I should just show it to you with the shadow off. Yeah, let's just turn the shadow off completely. So what can you do with two lights? Quite a lot, actually. You can, of course, simulate more than one light in your instance, but then, for example, we have this point light, and I'm adding kind of a key light in the back of him, right? So it looks pretty nice. And that's another reason why I didn't have it cast a shadow, because it's a key light, right? It doesn't, in photography or something like that, you don't really need a shadow from a key light, usually. Anyway, so that's usually like the traditional way of doing it, right? You add some kind of extra bounce light or a key light or something like that. But what you can do with cables is actually go into negative values of a light and then paint over um, another light's location. Okay, this looks a bit wild, but you can get into interesting territory where you can remove light from another light. Yeah, that makes sense. So just because you can, try it. Just go into negative values and see what you can do. You can even like fake shadows if you want to do like really performative projects or something like that. You can just have this point light with negative intensity and then just like draw in shadows. But yeah, a little bit time consuming, but might be worth it. Definitely try it. What else? Should we look at lights just by themselves? Oh, yes, of course. What about mesh instancing? Yeah, they work with shadows too. And it's pretty cool because you can uh, add quite a lot to your scene with a nice shadow. And here I also use the face culling way of making sure I don't get any weird artifacts in my shadows. And I have my Viz texture showing me the shadow so I can frame it correctly. And other than that, it's just a mesh instancer with a shadow under a Phong material. And we can control the location. And the cool thing is the shadow will hit other instances, right? So there, you can get into nice effects where you get this like cloud of meshes and geometry that then cast shadows onto each other, and it looks really nice. Yeah, so definitely try it out. I want to see some projects from you that use shadows and custom lights and all that stuff. And yeah, thank you, and enjoy. See you at the meetup. Bye.